The bell at Willowbrook Manor rang only once, a thin, trembling sound that seemed to vanish into the heavy summer air before anyone quite understood its meaning. By the time Mrs. Ellison, the housekeeper, reached the front hall, the bell rope still swayed gently, as though touched by an invisible hand. The manor itself appeared unchanged, sunlight filtering through tall windows, dust motes dancing lazily. But something indefinable had shifted, leaving the house with the faint, uneasy sensation of having drawn a breath it could not release. Sir Reginald Hawthorne lay dead in his private study at the back of the house. The room was locked from the inside, the key found later in his waistcoat pocket, and the tall French windows opening onto the rose garden were secured fast, their bolts firmly in place. Sir Reginald sat upright at his desk, his expression oddly serene, as though death had come upon, in the middle of a pleasant thought. There were no signs of violence, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Only a single small wound at the base of his neck suggested that this was not a natural passing. The doctor from the village confirmed what everyone already suspected. Sir Reginald had been murdered. The instrument used was slender and sharp, something precise rather than brutal. Yet no such object could be found in the study or anywhere else in the house. The impossibility of it all spread quickly among the residents and staff, settling like a chill beneath the summer heat. Willowbrook Manor was full that weekend. Sir Reginald had invited several guests to stay, including his niece Clara, newly returned from abroad, Major Fletcher, an old army companion, and Mrs. Pembroke, a distant cousin whose finances were perpetually precarious. The servants, too, were numerous enough to muddy any clear understanding of movements and motives. Everyone had an opinion, and every opinion contradicted the next. What baffled the local constable most was the clue found on the desk beside the body, a pressed sprig of lavender, carefully laid atop an open ledger. It seemed absurdly delicate in the face of murder, more the sort of thing one might tuck into a book to mark a pleasant memory. Sir Reginald was not known for sentimentality, nor did he grow lavender anywhere on the grounds. The nearest patch bloomed wild along the lane nearly half a mile away. The ledger itself contained nothing remarkable, columns of figures, notes about rents and repairs, except for one entry, circled in red ink, dated 3 days earlier. Beside the figures was a single word, resolved. No one could say what had been resolved or why it merited such emphasis. The locked room only deepened the confusion. Mrs. Ellison swore she had seen Sir Reginald retire to his study just after 9 the previous evening. She heard him bolt the door, a habit he had developed after a minor burglary years before. No one reported seeing him alive after that. The house settled for the night, undisturbed until the bell rang in the late morning, when the maid sent to bring Sir Reginald his tea received no answer. Speculation ran rampant. Some insisted the lavender must be a woman's calling card, others argued it was meant to mislead. Clara Hawthorne dismissed it all as nonsense, yet her agitation was evident. Major Fletcher, pacing the gravel outside, muttered darkly about enemies from the past. Mrs. Pembroke wept in fits, though whether from grief or fear was impossible to say. The constable, earnest but overwhelmed, examined every inch of the study again and again, finding nothing new. The door had not been forced, the windows were untouched. If Sir Reginald had admitted his killer, he had done so willingly, and then locked the door behind them, an act that defied all common sense. It was late afternoon when Miss Jane Marple arrived at Willowbrook Manor, ostensibly to visit an old friend in the village, but drawn, as she so often was, by the faint ripple of disturbance that follows human wrongdoing. She sat quietly in the drawing-room, knitting needles clicking softly, listening as fragments of the story reached her ears. The lavender, the ledger, the locked door, all these settled into her mind with a curious familiarity. To others the crime seemed impossible. To Miss Marple it already had the shape of something sadly, very human. Miss Marple remained in the drawing-room while the household moved about her in restless currents. She did not announce herself as an investigator, nor did she seek an audience with the constable. Instead, she listened. Listening, she had always found, encouraged people to talk in ways questioning never could. Mrs. Ellison soon settled opposite her with a tray of tea, clearly relieved to find someone who appeared calm. "A dreadful business," the housekeeper said, lowering her voice as if Sir Reginald might still overhear. And that little sprig of lavender, such a strange thing. I can't imagine how it came to be there. Miss Marple smiled faintly and stirred her tea. Lavender has a habit of turning up where one least expects it. It grows wild in many places. But not here, Mrs. Ellison insisted. Sir Reginald wouldn't have tolerated it in his gardens, said it reminded him of hospitals. Miss Marple nodded, storing that away. Hospitals, she thought, and antiseptic smells. Associations mattered. When Clara Hawthorne entered, she stopped short at the sight of Miss Marple, her expression tightening before smoothing into polite curiosity. Miss Marple noticed how her gaze flicked toward the hallway leading to the study, then away again. "You must excuse us," Clara said. "This has been a terrible shock." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "Such things are never easy. I was just admiring how very orderly the house is. Everything seems to have its proper place." Clara's lips pressed together for a moment. "My uncle insisted on it. Disorder made him anxious. And yet," Miss Marple continued, "there was something in his study that did not belong." Clara stiffened. "The lavender, you mean?" "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "And the ledger left open. An untidy habit that, for a man who valued order." Clara excused herself soon after, claiming a headache. Miss Marple watched her go, noticing how carefully she closed the door behind her, as though sound itself might betray her. Later, Miss Marple took a slow turn through the house, leaning lightly on her cane. The constable passed her in the corridor, hat in hand, looking preoccupied. He nodded, but did not stop her. She paused near the study door, now unlocked, and peered inside. The room smelled faintly of polish and something sharper beneath it. Not lavender, she thought, but something medicinal, long faded yet persistent. On the desk the ledger still lay open. Miss Marple did not touch it, but she bent close enough to see the red-circled word again. Resolved. It reminded her of the sorts of notes one makes after a decision reluctantly reached. She glanced at the inkstand. The red ink was nearly empty, the black ink scarcely touched. Curious that Sir Reginald should choose red for emphasis when he rarely used it otherwise. As she straightened, her eyes fell upon the wastepaper basket. It was empty. Too empty. A man who worked daily at his desk would have discarded something, an envelope, a torn note. The basket had been cleared recently, perhaps too recently. In the corridor outside she encountered Major Fletcher, who was pacing with barely contained impatience. He greeted her curtly. "Can't make head nor tail of it," he said. "Locked room nonsense. Probably suicide, dressed up to look dramatic." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "And the wound at his neck?" The Major waved a hand. "Accidents happen." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "But accidents rarely tidy up after themselves." His eyes flickered, just for a moment, before he turned away, muttering about fresh air. As evening drew in, Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room. Mrs. Pembroke sat there alone, twisting a handkerchief. When Miss Marple mentioned the lavender again, Mrs. Pembroke gasped. "Oh no," she said quickly. "I know nothing of that, nothing at all." Miss Marple patted her arm. "I didn't say you did, my dear." The woman flushed, confused. Iron and fear warring on her face. Bit by bit, small cracks appeared, an over-hasty denial, a ledger too neatly arranged, a study scrubbed of refuse but not of scent. None of it proved anything yet, but together they suggested intention rather than chance. Miss Marple returned to her knitting as dusk settled over Willowbrook Manor, her needles moving steadily while her mind worked just as quietly. Someone in that house had tried very hard to make the crime seem impossible, and in doing so had left the first faint traces of deception behind. Dinner at Willowbrook Manor was a strained affair, taken in near silence and broken only by the clink of cutlery and the occasional forced remark about the weather. Miss Marple observed it all from the far end of the table, her mild eyes taking in every hesitation and hurried glance. People revealed themselves most readily, she had found, when pretending nothing was wrong. Afterwards, the constable began his formal questioning in the small morning-room, one person at a time. Miss Marple was not officially included, yet no one thought to exclude her. She sat quietly in a corner chair, knitting resting in her lap, her presence so unassuming it seemed to encourage candour, or the appearance of it. Clara Hawthorne was questioned first. She spoke calmly, too calmly, describing her evening in precise detail. She had read in her room, she said, retiring early with a headache. She had not seen her uncle after supper. "You heard nothing?" the constable asked. "Nothing at all," Clara replied at once. Then, after a fractional pause, she added, "Well, no, that's not quite true. I heard the bell, of course. Everyone did. But nothing during the night." "No," Clara said firmly, though her fingers tightened around the arms of her chair. Miss Marple noticed how she avoided mentioning the study altogether, as though the room itself were best left unspoke. Major Fletcher followed. He was brisk, almost cheerful, recounting an evening spent walking the grounds and smoking by the window of his room. He claimed to have seen lights in the study well past midnight. Sir Reginald was often a night owl, he said. Could have been working on his accounts. "You're quite sure of the time?" Miss Marple asked gently. The Major hesitated. "Near midnight, or shortly after." "I wasn't watching the clock." Later, he would insist to Mrs. Ellison that the lights had been out by 11, a small thing perhaps, but time, Miss Marple knew, had a way of slipping only when one was uncertain what it should say. Mrs. Pembroke wept openly during her questioning, protesting her ignorance with such fervour that it bordered on desperation. She spoke at length about her affection for Sir Reginald, and her gratitude for his generosity. "He promised to help me," she sobbed. "He said everything would be resolved." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. "Resolved?" she repeated kindly. Mrs. Pembroke looked startled. "Did I say that? I only meant settled. He was very kind." Yet she could not quite meet Miss Marple's gaze after that, and her story wandered in circles, repeating itself without adding anything new. Mrs. Ellison, practical and composed, provided a steadier account. She confirmed Sir Reginald's habits, his fondness for routine, his insistence on locking the study door at night. "He wouldn't have opened it for just anyone," she said, "unless he was expecting them." "Did he expect someone last night?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Ellison frowned. "If he did, he didn't say so. Though, now I think of it, he asked me earlier in the day whether the red ink had been replaced." The constable looked up sharply. "Red ink?" "Yes," Mrs. Ellison said. "He seldom used it, but he wanted it fresh. No one could say why." As the questioning continued, the same notes recurred like a melody slightly off-key. Everyone agreed Sir Reginald had seemed preoccupied that day. Everyone insisted they had heard nothing unusual in the night, yet no two accounts aligned precisely. Time shifted, details blurred, small, careful omissions surfaced where clarity ought to have been. Miss Marple said little, but she watched closely when questions turned to the lavender. Clara denied knowing anything of it. Mrs. Pembroke claimed she disliked the scent. Major Fletcher laughed and said flowers were women's nonsense. Mrs. Ellison alone mentioned that the maid had returned from the village that afternoon with a basket of washing and had passed the lane where lavender grew wild. "And the maid?" Miss Marple asked. "She left early this morning," Mrs. Ellison replied, shaken by the discovery. Poor girl, too convenient, Miss Marple thought, too easily dismissed. By the end of the evening, the constable looked no nearer to the truth than when he had begun. Yet Miss Marple felt the faint satisfaction of threads beginning to show. The contradictions were not random. They clustered around certain moments, certain words, resolved, the red ink, the study door. As the household retired, Miss Marple lingered by the window, watching the last light fade from the manor. Somewhere within those walls someone had spoken too carefully, and another not carefully enough. The voices of deception had been heard. All that remained was to understand what they were trying so hard to conceal. Morning light crept into Willowbrook Manor with deceptive gentleness, softening corners and lending the house an air of innocence it did not deserve. Miss Marple was already awake, seated by the window with her knitting, watching the garden paths come into view. It was in daylight, she reflected, that motives revealed themselves most clearly. Darkness hid actions. Morning exposed reasons. By common consent, Sir Reginald had been a difficult man. Not cruel exactly, but firm, unyielding in matters of money and reputation. That firmness now appeared to have left a trail of quiet resentments behind it. Miss Marple began, quite unobtrusively, to follow that trail. Clara Hawthorne's motive lay closest to the surface. She was Sir Reginald's nearest living relative, and his fortune was substantial. Yet inheritance alone rarely explained such careful staging. Clara had returned from abroad unexpectedly, her finances whispered to be strained. More telling, however, was her uncle's recent interest in his accounts. The circled ledger entry suggested a decision reached shortly before his death. If Sir Reginald had intended to alter his will or withdraw support, Clara would have had reason to fear rather than hope his passing. Fear, Miss Marple knew, could drive people to desperate measures. Mrs. Pembroke's position was even more precarious. Dependent upon Sir Reginald's goodwill, she lived in constant anxiety of being cast off. Her repeated use of the word resolve troubled Miss Marple. It echoed too neatly the ledger entry, as though Sir Reginald had promised her something, and perhaps then changed his mind. Gratitude might easily sour into panic if that promise were withdrawn. Major Fletcher's motive was less obvious but no less real. Old comrades shared old secrets, and Sir Reginald's orderly habits suggested he kept careful records. A ledger might contain more than figures if one knew where to look. The Major's shifting account of the study lights hinted at a need to place Sir Reginald alive at a certain time, or dead by another. It was not affection that made him pace the gravel so restlessly. Then there were the servants. Mrs. Ellison was loyal, almost fiercely so, but loyalty sometimes concealed long-held grievances. The maid's sudden departure troubled Miss Marple most. A frightened girl made an excellent vessel for misplaced blame, or a convenient absence if questions grew uncomfortable. Lavender could easily have brushed her skirt along the lane, but Lavender pressed so neatly, so deliberately, spoke of intention rather than accident. Miss Marple asked to see the constable again, this time with the ledger before them. She traced the circled entry with her finger. Resolve often follows disagreement, she said mildly. It suggests an end to uncertainty. Someone believed their troubles were over, or about to be. The constable nodded, though his brow remained furrowed. But whose troubles? That, Miss Marple replied, is where motives overlap. She asked quietly about Sir Reginald's will. It had been reviewed only a week earlier. No changes had yet been signed, but drafts existed. Clara stood to gain less under the new arrangement. Mrs. Pembroke would have lost her allowance entirely. The Major's name appeared nowhere, yet a separate note referred to an old debt settled long ago, or so Sir Reginald believed. Greed, fear, and resentment twisted together until no single strand could be isolated. Any one of them might have wished Sir Reginald dead. Yet none explained the locked room, the precise wound, the absence of the weapon, and the curious theatricality of the lavender. Miss Marple returned again to the study, standing where Sir Reginald had sat. From that position the bell rope was just within reach. A man expecting confrontation might well keep it close. She imagined voices raised, then lowered, a decision announced, fear tightening into resolve. The room had been locked afterward not to keep someone out, she thought, but to keep the moment intact, to preserve an illusion of impossibility. Someone had wanted time, confusion, and misdirection. Lavender softened the scene, lending it sentiment, perhaps. Even pity. Red ink emphasized finality. By midday, Miss Marple felt the maze narrowing. Motives no longer lay scattered, they overlapped, converging toward a single moment when Sir Reginald's resolve collided with someone else's desperation. The truth was there, waiting patiently, as truths often did. One final connection remained unseen, but Miss Marple was quite certain it would soon reveal itself by late afternoon. The mood at Willowbrook Manor shifted perceptibly. The constable returned from the village with an air of subdued triumph, carrying with him a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Word spread quickly, and by the time he gathered everyone in the drawing-room, anticipation had replaced the earlier unease. The parcel was unwrapped to reveal a slender hat-pin, its steel shaft stained dark near the tip. It had been found along the lane where lavender grew wild, half buried in the dust as though discarded in haste. The constable explained that the maid traced to her aunt's cottage had owned such a pin. When questioned, she admitted to being near the manor late that evening, having returned to fetch something she claimed to have forgotten. She panicked, the constable said, clearly satisfied. Young girl, frightened by what she'd seen, dropped the pin and fled. The relief in the room was palpable. Mrs. Pembroke pressed a hand to her mouth and murmured a prayer of thanks. Major Fletcher nodded grimly, as if a necessary unpleasantness had been settled. Clara Hawthorne closed her eyes, letting out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the night before. Miss Marple alone remained still. The logic on the surface was compelling. The pin matched the wound. The lavender connected the lane to the study. The maid's absence now appeared less convenient and more incriminating. The locked room could be explained, the constable suggested, by Sir Reginald himself. Securing the door before collapsing. A tragic accident, born of fear and misunderstanding. Yet, as the constable spoke, Miss Marple felt a familiar unease settle in her chest. The pieces fit too neatly, like a puzzle forced into completion. Real life, she had found, was rarely so accommodating. "May I see the pin?" she asked gently. The constable hesitated, then handed it to her. Miss Marple examined it carefully. It was plain, unadorned, the sort one might wear daily. Too plain, perhaps. Sir Reginald's wound had been described as precise, deliberate. A hatpin could do it, but only if wielded with confidence and intent. "And the lavender?" Miss Marple asked. "Was it found with the pin?" "No," the constable said. "That was in the study, as we know." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "Pressed, not crushed. That suggests it was placed there with care, not brushed in accidentally." Her observation was met with polite smiles. The case, everyone felt, had reached its natural conclusion. The constable ordered arrangements made to bring the maid back for formal charges. The household began to relax, conversations turning cautiously toward departures and practicalities. That evening, Miss Marple sat once more by the window, watching the garden darken. The false calm unsettled her. If the maid were guilty, fear alone would have driven her to clumsier actions, not the careful locking of doors and removal of waste paper. And there was the red ink, still unexplained, and the ledger entry that spoke of resolution, not panic. She thought again of the hatpin. It bore no sign of lavender oil, no trace of the faint medicinal scent lingering in the study, and the maid, by all accounts, had adored Sir Reginald. Fear, yes. Malice, no. A sudden sound drew her attention, a sharp cry from the upper floor, quickly stifled. Doors opened, footsteps hurried. Miss Marple rose slowly, her heart sinking. With certainty rather than surprise. Moments later, Mrs. Ellison appeared, pale and shaken. "It's Mrs. Pembroke," she whispered. "She's collapsed. Says someone's been in her room." The constable rushed past, orders already forming on his lips. The household stirred again, fear replacing relief with alarming speed. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace. A false victory, she reflected, often emboldened the truly guilty. With suspicion momentarily diverted, someone had grown careless, or bold. As she climbed the stairs, Miss Marple knew the case was far from over. The shadows had merely shifted, and the real criminal, feeling safe at last, had moved too soon. Mrs. Pembroke's room bore the unmistakable signs of disturbance, though nothing appeared overtly stolen. A drawer stood ajar, its contents hastily rearranged, and the small escritoire by the window had been forced open with clumsy impatience. Mrs. Pembroke herself lay propped against the pillows, trembling and pale, insisting between gasps that someone had been searching for something, and that they would return. Miss Marple stood quietly at the foot of the bed while the constable asked brisk questions. What was missing? Had she locked her door? Had she recognized any sound? Mrs. Pembroke could answer none of it coherently. Yet when the constable left to search the corridor, Miss Marple moved closer, her voice soft and steady. "You were frightened because they found nothing," she said gently. "Whatever it was, it isn't here any more, is it?" Mrs. Pembroke's eyes filled with tears. "I shouldn't have kept it," she whispered. "I thought it was safe." Miss Marple did not press her further. Fear loosened tongues only when it felt understood. Later that night, as calm was restored with difficulty, Miss Marple asked Mrs. Ellison for access to Sir Reginald's private papers. They were kept, as it turned out, not in the study, but in a locked cabinet in the library, an old-fashioned piece rarely opened. Inside were letters tied with ribbon, neatly dated, some yellowed with age. Miss Marple read slowly, carefully, the past unfolding line by line. One name recurred with quiet insistence: Edward Mallory. The letters spoke of a scandal long buried, a failed investment, accusations of fraud, a ruined reputation. Sir Reginald's hand was firm and unemotional as he detailed the necessity of cutting ties, of protecting the family name. Mallory's replies were bitter, desperate, pleading for reconsideration. The final letter, written decades earlier, ended abruptly. Mallory had disappeared soon after. Ruined men, Miss Marple reflected, rarely vanished without leaving ripples. The following morning she spoke to Major Fletcher while they walked the garden path. At the mention of Edward Mallory, the Major stopped short. "Haven't heard that name in years," he said slowly. "A bad business. Reginald testified against him, you know. Said it was the right thing to do." "And you agreed?" Miss Marple asked. The Major's jaw tightened. It was necessary. Necessity again, Miss Marple thought. How often it excused cruelty. Clara Hawthorne knew the name as well. She grew pale when Miss Marple mentioned it, then recovered herself too quickly. "My mother spoke of him," she said. "Said my uncle had destroyed a man's life. She never forgave him for it." And Mrs. Pembroke, when pressed gently, finally confessed. Among her possessions was a packet of letters written by Edward Mallory, kept all these years as leverage. Mallory had been her brother. Sir Reginald had promised compensation years later, when guilt softened his resolve. Recently he had decided against it. "He said it was time to put the past behind us," Mrs. Pembroke sobbed. "He said the matter was resolved." The word echoed again, heavy now with meaning. Miss Marple felt the pieces settle at last. Sir Reginald's resolve had not been financial alone. It had been moral, self-justifying. Someone else, however, had refused to let the past remain buried. The letters, the ledger, the red ink, they were all connected to that old injustice. The lavender, too, took on new significance. Edward Mallory had once worked in a convalescent home where lavender was grown to soothe patients. The scent, once comforting, now lingered like accusation. By afternoon, Miss Marple understood why Mrs. Pembroke's room had been searched. Those letters were dangerous. They tied the present crime to an old one, linking Clara's inherited resentment, the Major's loyalty, and Mrs. Pembroke's long-held fear. Someone wanted that connection erased. As she sat quietly once more, Miss Marple realized the murder had not been an act of sudden desperation, but the final consequence of a grievance carried patiently through years. The past had reached forward, demanding recognition, and now, with the false culprit nearly condemned and the real truth stirring uneasily beneath the surface, the one responsible knew time was running out. That evening, Miss Marple asked Mrs. Ellison for a small favour. Nothing dramatic, merely that tea be served in the library rather than the drawing-room, and that Sir Reginald's old cabinet be left open, its contents visible to anyone who happened to glance inside. Mrs. Ellison agreed, though she looked doubtful. Miss Marple thanked her kindly, as if the request were no more than a preference for better light. By the time the household gathered, the cabinet stood ajar, the ribboned letters resting plainly on the table beneath it. Miss Marple sat nearby, her knitting in her lap, needles idle. She spoke easily of inconsequential things, the weather turning cooler, the roses needing pruning, while watching faces rather than listening to replies. Major Fletcher noticed the letters almost at once, his gaze fixed on them with a sharpness that vanished the moment he realized he was being observed. Clara followed his look, her expression flickering with something like panic before she masked it behind polite indifference. Mrs. Pembroke, entering last, faltered entirely and had to grip the back of a chair to steady herself. Miss Marple rose then, smiling apologetically. "I do hope you don't mind," she said. "I find old letters so instructive. They remind us how very long memories can be." No one answered. She reached out and lifted one letter, turning it so the name Edward Mallory was visible at the top. "Such a sad history," she went on. "Lives entwined in ways no one ever quite escapes." Mrs. Pembroke began to speak, then stopped, glancing nervously at Clara. The Major cleared his throat. "It's all ancient history," he said brusquely. "Irrelevant now." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "I wonder. People often imagine the past grows tired of waiting." She let the words settle, then added, almost as an afterthought, "The constable will be very interested to know these letters still exist, particularly since one of them refers to a visit paid to Sir Reginald on the very evening he died." The reaction was immediate. Clara turned sharply toward Miss Marple. "That's impossible," she said too quickly. "No one visited him." Miss Marple looked at her with gentle curiosity. "I didn't say who," she replied. The room fell silent. It was the sort of silence that pressed in on itself, revealing every breath. Miss Marple waited. She had learned long ago that people filled silence with truth far more readily than with lies. At last Major Fletcher spoke again, his voice strained. "This is absurd. You're upsetting everyone for nothing." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said. "I'm hoping to prevent further upset." She moved to the cabinet and removed a small notebook tucked behind the letters. "This was overlooked," she said. "Sir Reginald kept it apart from his accounts. In it, He recorded conversations of particular importance. She did not open the notebook. She did not need to. Its power lay in the belief that she already had. He wrote of confronting someone, Miss Marple continued, someone connected to Edward Mallory. He believed the matter resolved, you see, but he was mistaken. Mrs. Pembroke gave a small cry and buried her face in her hands. Clara stood rigid, her colour draining. The Major's composure finally cracked. He took a step back, as though the room itself had shifted. Miss Marple turned to him. "You were there, weren't you? Not as the murderer, but as the witness. Loyal as always. Loyal enough to help afterward." "That's not," he began, then stopped. His shoulders sagged. "Reginald called her to the study," he said quietly. "Clara." He meant to tell her everything, to explain why the past had to remain buried. Clara's breath hitched. "He was going to ruin us all," she said. "He said it was necessary. Just like before." When he turned his back, Miss Marple said softly, "You used what was close at hand. Something slender. Something precise." Clara looked down at her hands as though seeing them anew. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "I only wanted him to stop." Miss Marple nodded. The locked door, the lavender, the careful placing of the ledger, those were acts of control, not panic. "And the Major helped you afterward, didn't he? Out of loyalty to the family." The Major did not deny it. When the constable arrived moments later, summoned quietly by Mrs. Ellison, the truth was already laid bare. Miss Marple returned to her chair, picking up her knitting once more. The unconventional clue had never been the letters or the notebook, but the human nay. Ed to protect old wrongs. Faced with the past made visible, deception had faltered at last. The constable's arrival brought a flurry of movement, voices overlapping as order was reasserted with the clumsy confidence of authority. Clara sat rigid, eyes fixed on the carpet, while Major Fletcher stood apart, his face set in grim resignation. Miss Marple remained where she was, needles clicking softly, aware that momentum had a curious way of provoking rashness. It happened while the constable stepped into the corridor to call for assistance. A faint smell reached Miss Marple first, not the medicinal sharpness she had noticed before, but something acrid and unmistakable. Smoke. She rose at once. In the library, the small grate had been laid and lit with unusual haste. Mrs. Ellison stood frozen by the door, staring as Major Fletcher thrust a handful of papers into the flames. He looked up, startled, as Miss Marple entered. "Too late?" he said hoarsely. "It should never have come to this." The letters curled and blackened, their ink flaring briefly before collapsing into ash. Miss Marple moved swiftly to the table, snatching the notebook from where it lay. She pressed it to her chest, her voice calm but firm. "You won't burn that," she said. "Not now." The Major's shoulders sagged. "Those letters were poison," he muttered. "They would have destroyed what little dignity any of us had left, and by destroying them," Miss Marple replied gently, "you would only confirm their importance." The constable returned, alarmed by the smoke, and took in the scene with dawning comprehension. Orders were given, the fire was extinguished. Too much, however, was already lost. The letters, Edward Mallory's voice across the years, were gone, reduced to grey remnants drifting on the hearth. Clara looked up then, something like relief flickering through her distress. "Without them," she said fain. "Cly, there's nothing left to prove." "On the contrary," Miss Marple interrupted, "there is quite enough." Yet she felt the truth wobble precariously. The letters had been the bridge between past and present, the tangible proof of motive. Without them, the case relied too heavily on confession, and confessions, she knew, could be recanted, muddied, reinterpreted, trust frayed at the edges of the room. Mrs. Pembroke wept anew, distraught not only at the crime but at the destruction of the last connection to her brother. Mrs. Ellison avoided everyone's gaze, ashamed she had not stopped it sooner. The constable looked uncertain, his earlier confidence replaced by a cautious wariness. Miss Marple opened the notebook at last. Inside were Sir Reginald's careful, clipped entries, dates, initials, terse summaries. One page bore a final note, written in red ink: "Spoke with CH tonight. Must insist. No further concessions. Matter resolved." It was enough to place Clara in the study that night, enough to contradict her alibi, enough, perhaps, to secure a conviction. But Miss Marple sensed resistance gathering, the unspoken thought that evidence destroyed might as well never have existed. That night, sleep came fitfully to Willowbrook Manor. Doors were locked with renewed vigilance. Every footstep sounded louder, every whisper suspicious. Miss Marple lay awake, considering how easily truth could be smothered when people chose comfort over justice. Near dawn, Mrs. Ellison knocked at her door, pale and breathless. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "someone's been in the study again. They went together." The desk had been disturbed, the inkstand tipped, red ink staining the blotter like a spreading wound. The waste-paper basket, which had remained conspicuously empty, now held a single charred scrap, part of a letter that had escaped the fire. Miss Marple lifted it carefully. One word remained. "Illegible lavender." She closed her eyes briefly. Someone had hoped to erase even the suggestion of symbolism, to turn meaning into coincidence. Instead, they had confirmed intent. As the sky lightened beyond the windows, Miss Marple felt the stakes settle into sharp clarity. The truth had been attacked, twice now, not out of panic calculation. Whoever sought to bury it underestimated how stubborn facts could be, and how even ashes, if examined closely enough, still told stories. She placed the scrap carefully into her handbag. Trust was indeed fragile, but truth, she reflected, was remarkably resilient, and it was not finished with Willowbrook Manor yet. The morning had scarcely settled when the calm fractured again. Miss Marple was in the small sitting-room, examining the charred scrap she had salvaged, when a sharp sound echoed through the house, a door slamming hard enough to rattle the frames. Almost at once came raised voices, then a shout cut short as though smothered by distance. Miss Marple rose, heart thudding with an instinct she had learned to trust, and stepped into the corridor just as Mrs. Ellison emerged from the opposite end, her face drained of colour. "It's Major Fletcher," she said breathlessly. "In the garden." They found him beneath the old yew tree at the far edge of the rose beds, collapsed awkwardly against the stone bench. At first glance, it looked as though he had simply sat down and failed to rise again. The constable knelt beside him, fingers moving to his neck, then froze. "He's dead," he said quietly. The shock rippled outward, heavier than before. Major Fletcher had been under watch, informal perhaps, but watched nonetheless. His death could not be brushed aside as coincidence. There were no obvious wounds, no blood to explain such suddenness. His face, however, bore a curious expression, not fear but surprise, as though realization had come a moment too late. Miss Marple noticed the crushed petals beneath his hand. "Lavender," the constable's voice tightened. "Poison, most likely. We'll need the doctor. And we'll need to consider," Miss Marple added softly, who stood to benefit from his silence. Clara was brought down, pale and shaking, horror eclipsing even her earlier distress. "I didn't," she began, then faltered. "I wouldn't." Miss Marple believed her. Major Fletcher's death did nothing to strengthen Clara's position. If anything, it complicated matters dangerously. He had been the one person who might have corroborated parts of her confession, or contradicted them in crucial ways. Mrs. Pembroke, on the other hand, had retreated into a rigid stillness. She watched the activity from the doorway, her eyes fixed on the yew tree as though afraid it might speak. The doctor confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. Poison administered recently, something swift, discreet, something that could be mistaken for a heart failing under strain. "He must have known something," the constable said grimly, "or been about to say it." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and whoever acted believed time was against them." The investigation lurched forward again, its direction sharply altered. Major Fletcher's pockets yielded little, no note, no sign of despair. But in the lining of his jacket, Miss Marple noticed a faint reddish smear, almost invisible unless one looked closely. "Ink," she murmured, "red ink." Back inside, tension thickened the air. Doors were locked, no one moved without being seen, trust already fragile shattered completely. Each glance carried suspicion now, each silence heavy with implication. Miss Marple felt it too, the sense of being pursued rather than pursuing. Someone had acted boldly, decisively in daylight. Not a frightened accomplice scrambling to cover tracks, but a calculating mind willing to risk everything to regain control of the narrative. As the constable organized the house, Mrs. Ellison drew Miss Marple aside. "There's something else," she whispered. "Mrs. Pembroke, she's gone." Her room was empty, the bed untouched, the window open just enough to admit the morning air. On the escritoire lay a single folded sheet of paper. Miss Marple opened it carefully. "I won't be silenced again, that was all." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Disappearance, murder, and destruction of evidence. 3 acts, each escalating the last. Whoever was behind it all was no longer reacting but directing events, trying to reshape the truth before it could harden. "She's either running," the constable said, "or she's been taken, or," Miss Marple said gravely, "she believes she's protecting something or someone more important than her own safety." The realization settled with chilling clarity. The past had not merely motivated the first crime, it had armed the present one. Edward Mallory's shadow still moved among them, not as a man, but as a grievance passed hand to hand. Miss Marple looked once more toward the garden, where the yew tree stood unmoved, ancient and watchful. The villain was indeed still ahead, willing to kill again, willing to vanish, willing to let others take the blame. And now Miss Marple understood, solving the crime was no longer enough. Someone else's life hung in the balance, and the next move, hers or theirs, would decide who survived Willowbrook Manor's final reckoning. In the uneasy quiet that followed Mrs. Pembroke's disappearance, Miss Marple found herself oddly calm. Panic scattered attention, calm gathered it. She returned to the small sitting room and laid out the fragments she had collected, not physically, but in her mind, letting them rest beside one another until their edges began to align. Lavender, red ink, the bell, the yew tree. Each had appeared more than once, not randomly, but with a deliberateness that suggested ritual rather than impulse. Someone had been repeating themselves. People did that, Miss Marple knew, when they believed a particular gesture had meaning, when habit masqueraded as cleverness. She thought again of the bell, rung only once, its rope still swaying. Sir Reginald had been precise to the point of obsession. If he rang for help, he would have rung twice. Once was not a summons, it was a signal. To someone who understood it, Miss Marple asked Mrs. Ellison to make tea, not because she wanted it, but because she wanted to watch. Mrs. Ellison moved efficiently, automatically, selecting cups without conscious thought. When she reached for the sugar, she hesitated, then chose the tongs instead of the spoon. "You always do that," Miss Marple observed pleasantly. Mrs. Ellison smiled faintly. Sir Reginald disliked spoons in the sugar bowl, said they carried traces of everything. Traces. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the tray, the teapot, the cups, the milk jug, handled by many hands, every day. A perfect delivery system for something subtle, something that could be mistaken for weakness of the heart. "And lavender?" Miss Marple asked, as though continuing an idle conversation. "You don't care for it, do you?" Mrs. Ellison stiffened almost imperceptibly. "It's useful," she said. "Keeps linen fresh, keeps moths away, and masks other scents," Miss Marple thought. She excused herself and went instead to the garden, standing beneath the yew where Major Fletcher had died. Yew was an old poison, familiar to those who tended gardens seriously. Sir Reginald would have known it. So would someone who had managed his household for years. The pattern sharpened suddenly, like an image snapping into focus. Access, habit, control. The murderer had not needed force or opportunity wrested from chance. They had needed only routine and trust. Miss Marple returned to the house and asked the constable for a quiet word. She spoke not of grand theories but of small things: who poured the tea, who bled the ink, who decided which flowers were cut and which left to grow wild. The constable listened, frowning, as the implications settled. "Mrs. Ellison," he said at last, "but she's been here forever. Loyal as they come." "Loyalty," Miss Marple said gently, "is not the same as kindness. Nor is it immune to resentment. Sir Reginald had destroyed Edward Mallory with a sense of righteousness. Someone close to him had watched that happen. Someone who had watched other injustices too, small humiliations absorbed daily, year after year. Someone who believed they knew better than Sir Reginald what was necessary. The bell rang again, sharp and insistent. This time, twice. They found Mrs. Ellison in the pantry, seated heavily on a stool, her face drawn but composed. On the table before her lay a small vial, empty now, and beside it a folded napkin faintly scented with lavender. "It's done, then," she said quietly. "I wondered how long it would take you." She spoke without bitterness, only weariness. She had loved Sir Reginald once in her way, until love curdled into judgment. She had arranged the study that night, delivered the tea, locked the door afterward to preserve his dignity. The lavender had been mercy, she said. The red ink, his own final cruelty, turned against him. "And the Major?" the constable asked. "He was going to talk," Mrs. Ellison replied. "I couldn't allow that. Nor Mrs. Pembroke. She ran because she knew I would stop her if she tried to bargain again." Miss Marple listened, sorrow threading through her understanding. The pattern had indeed been in plain sight. The person who cleaned, arranged, served and soothed, who made order from other people's lives, had finally imposed her own. As Mrs. Ellison was led away, Miss Marple stood by the window once more. The manor seemed to exhale, as though a long-held tension had been released. Evil, she reflected, was rarely flamboyant. More often it was tidy, habitual, and convinced of its own necessity. The pattern had emerged at last, not from brilliance but from attention, and Willowbrook Manor, stripped of its secrets, stood quietly in the afternoon light, ordinary once more, as though nothing dreadful had ever happened there at all. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, knitting idle stitches while the constable recorded Mrs. Ellison's statements in precise detail. The household had grown subdued, attention mingling with relief, but Miss Marple knew the explanation had more layers than even Mrs. Ellison's weary confession could convey. There was something that had driven her to act with such deliberation, to orchestrate death, disappearance, and deception. The surface motives, loyalty, protection of family honour, explained part of it, but not the whole. She returned to the study, moving slowly, letting her eyes sweep over the desk, the blotter, the open cabinet. Sir Reginald's ledger lay as it had been arranged, neat, controlled, final. It was the embodiment of a life obsessed with order, yet someone had intervened, reshaping it to satisfy a personal sense of justice. Miss Marple considered that carefully. Justice, she reflected, need not be fair. Often it was obsessive, consuming, and cruel in its precision. Later she spoke again with Mrs. Pembroke, who had been persuaded to return once the immediate danger seemed past. Her eyes were still wide, shadows of fear lingering, yet she spoke openly this time. She admitted that her brother Edward Mallory's ruin had left a scar, a family disgrace long carried in silence. Sir Reginald's dealings had destroyed not only Edward's prospects but the lives of those close to him. The promises made afterward were more than financial. They were assurances that wounds might heal. Yet each promise was fragile, threatened by Sir Reginald. Natural rigour. Someone had seen those fragile promises collapse and decided that the past could not be left to wither unnoticed. Miss Marple considered this and finally addressed the room, speaking not only to those present, but to the silence that seemed to gather between them. Mrs. Ellison was never motivated by greed alone, she said, nor by the need to protect Sir Reginald's name. She acted because she could not bear the injustices of the past to remain unacknowledged. She had lived her life observing, serving, and enduring what she believed to be moral imbalance, and when opportunity presented itself she acted, not impulsively, but with conviction that what she did was inevitable. The constable furrowed his brow. "I understand loyalty, Miss Marple, but this is something else entirely. She killed to enforce her sense of right?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, and in doing so she revealed not malice but obsession. The careful preparation, the attention to detail, the elimination of witnesses, it was all part of maintaining a balance only she could see. To her, Sir Reginald's death was a tragic necessity, Major Fletcher's silencing a preemptive caution, and Mrs. Pembroke's flight a threat to be managed. Clara Hawthorne, seated near the window, shivered visibly. But why all the care? The lavender, the red ink, the study left so carefully arranged? Miss Marple smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sorrow, because she could not tolerate chaos, even in death. For Mrs. Ellison, everything had to be controlled, even moral outcomes. The minutiae, the lavender, the positioning of the ledger, the timing of the bell, were her way of imposing order on what she saw as an unjust world. Mrs. Pembroke murmured, almost to herself. She thought she was preserving dignity. Yes, Miss Marple said, but preserving dignity became a rationale for extreme action. She was driven by a combination of morality, fear, and years of pent-up vigilance. Ordinary motives, money, inheritance, resentment, were insufficient to explain her behaviour. Her true motive lay in a psychological imperative to correct what she had long perceived as wrong in a manner only she deemed fitting. The constable glanced at her, realizing the enormity of what she had unveiled. The crime was no longer merely an isolated act of revenge or opportunity. It was the enactment of a carefully considered philosophy, a psychological calculus that left no room for compromise. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirts. She looked out the window at the fading afternoon light falling over Willowbrook Manor. "It is a dangerous thing," she said, "to live a life of observation and judgment unchecked." Mrs. Ellison acted according to what she thought right, but she disregarded the lives around her in doing so. That, I suppose, is the shock of it, the depth of certainty, the willingness to commit acts others would scarcely imagine. The house seemed to exhale, as if recognizing the unveiling of this hidden layer. The surface motives had been exposed, yes, but the true force, the internal architecture of obsession, vigilance, and moral absolutism, was now clear. Mrs. Ellison's mind, methodical and unyielding, had turned morality into action, action into crime, and crime into a pattern that only a careful observer like Miss Marple could perceive. In that quiet understanding, the final pieces of the mystery clicked into place. The crime, she realized, had always been about more than money, power, or revenge. It had been about the mind that could not forget, forgive, or leave the past undisturbed, a mind that transformed loyalty and duty into something far more terrifying. Miss Marple waited until the late afternoon, when the household had grown quiet again, and the shadows in the core. Edoors stretched long and deliberate. She had laid her plans carefully, knowing that the final confrontation required not force or threats, but a subtle arrangement that would leave the culprit with no choice but to reveal herself. The manor itself became part of her strategy. The locked doors, the open windows, the lingering scent of lavender all set the stage. She asked Clara and Mrs. Pembroke to join her in the drawing-room, explaining that she wished to review the sequence of events for the constable who would arrive shortly. Mrs. Ellison predictably lingered near the door, insisting that she simply wanted to make sure the room was tidy. Miss Marple allowed it, all the while watching her closely. Every twitch, every glance, and every carefully modulated tone would serve as a piece of the puzzle, confirming what she already suspected. Miss Marple began speaking gently, recounting the chronology of Sir Reginald's final hours. She described the study, the ledger, the red ink, and the small but telling details. The bell rung once, the lavender pressed delicately, the disposal of the letters. She spoke in a manner that suggested speculation, not accusation, allowing the truth to rise to the surface on its own. "You see," she said softly, "the study was left so precisely because someone wished to preserve the illusion of order. Yet the minute a second person was involved, Major Fletcher, and later, the disturbance of Mrs. Pembroke's room, the pattern faltered, and then, of course, there was the hat-pin. Now, that alone could not have accomplished everything." Miss Marple let the silence settle, eyes fixed calmly on Mrs. Ellison. The tension in the room was palpable. Even Clara, pale and trembling, seemed to sense that Miss Marple was guiding the flow rather than speaking at random. "Someone wanted to control the narrative entirely," Miss Marple continued, "not merely to avenge a perceived wrong, nor to protect secrets. They needed the story to unfold as they intended, or the consequences, both past and present, would spiral beyond their grasp." Mrs. Ellison's fingers tightened on the edge of the doorframe. Her lips moved slightly, as if to speak, but she thought better of it. Miss Marple's gaze held her firmly, yet without malice, merely as a reflection of logic the woman could not deny. "I imagine," Miss Marple said lightly, "that it must have been exhausting, maintaining such vigilance for decades, observing, arranging, correcting, acting, finally, when opportunity permitted." She paused, letting her words sink. But even the most careful planning falters under scrutiny. Every detail, every habit, every trace of thought leaves evidence, and someone observing all of it can see through the pattern. Mrs. Ellison drew a slow breath, and in that moment, the composure that had carried her through years of quiet control cracked. Her hands fell to her sides. "Yes," she said, voice trembling. "It was me. I arranged it all. I had to. Someone had to see justice done when no one else would. I didn't intend harm, not more than necessary." Miss Marple nodded, serene. "You believed it was necessary, and in your mind it was. But the consequences are unavoidable now. Major Fletcher. He died because he could have undone your carefully constructed truth. And Sir Reginald, his death, while unfortunate, was the result of your intervention, not accident." The woman sank into the nearest chair, as though relief and terror mingled in equal measure. "I tried to leave nothing behind," she whispered. "The letters, the scrap of evidence. I thought it would be enough. But the past, it doesn't stay buried." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Indeed. And you see, it was the past itself, the echo of Edward Mallory, the unresolved grievances, that drove everything. What you did was clever, meticulous, even frightening, but you could not erase history, nor escape its influence on the present." The constable, who had quietly entered while Miss Marple spoke, stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Mrs. Ellison's arm. "I think it's time, ma'am." Mrs. Ellison nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. There was no struggle, no flight. The final trap had been her own conscience, guided by observation and reason rather than force. Miss Marple, calm and composed, allowed the authorities to take her away, her mind already sorting the last strands of detail. The manor, once tense and burdened with suspicion, now seemed to breathe again. Miss Marple stood by the window for a long moment, watching the fading light gild the gardens she had traversed so often during the investigation. Every clue, every habit, every subtle gesture had led to this resolution. The human mind, she reflected, could be both the most careful and the most vulnerable instrument of all. And in that quiet, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, Willowbrook Manor settled into a fragile peace, its secrets finally unmasked, its past accounted for, and its present no longer haunted by the meticulous hand that had tried to bend time, morality, and justice to its will. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room long after Mrs. Ellison had been escorted from the house. The manor had regained a measure of quiet, though the air still carried tension, as if the walls themselves remembered the crimes they had witnessed. Clara and Mrs. Pembroke had retreated upstairs, seeking comfort in each other's presence. The constable remained below, filing reports and ensuring that every piece of evidence had been secured. Yet Miss Marple felt that uneasy prickle she had learned to trust. The case seemed closed, tidy, and morally satisfying, but something tugged at the edges of her reso. A subtle inconsistency she could not ignore. She walked slowly back to the study, retracing steps she had followed countless times over the past days. The ledger lay where it had been arranged, the blotter dry, the ink faint but legible. The scent of lavender, faint yet persistent, seemed to linger in the corners like a whispered warning. She noticed then a detail that had escaped her before. The ledger, though carefully positioned, bore a small indentation on the side of a page, almost imperceptible. It was consistent with the tip of a pen pressed deliberately, yet not by Mrs. Ellison's usual hand. Miss Marple's sharp eyes narrowed. Someone had tampered with the record after she had observed it. Her thoughts returned to Clara. Pale and anxious, yes, but she had seemed genuinely distressed, even frightened by the confessions and revelations. Major Fletcher, deceased, could no longer complicate matters. Mrs. Pembroke had fled, but out of fear rather than malice. And yet this subtle alteration, the faint impression, suggested that someone else had been in the study recently. After everyone assumed the truth was known, Miss Marple quietly descended the back staircase, moving toward the servants' quarters, where she found a small scrap of paper half hidden beneath a table. It was a note, hastily folded, bearing a single sentence written in familiar, elegant handwriting. "The real truth cannot be left exposed." Her mind raced. Mrs. Ellison had acted with obsessive morality, yes, but someone else, someone with motive, knowledge, and cunning, must have been working in parallel. That someone had been careful, patient, and willing to let the spotlight fall on Mrs. Ellison while manipulating events from the shadows. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the garden stretched pale in the early evening light. A figure moved, deliberate, measured, almost confident. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. She had to act before this final player could vanish or enact another scheme. She returned to the drawing-room and asked the constable to remain with her. Together they waited, as though the house itself had grown silent in anticipation. Minutes later, the figure appeared at the doorway. Mr. Harcourt, the distant relative who had arrived late in the investigation and been conspicuously quiet throughout. He carried himself with an air of benign curiosity, Yet Miss Marple immediately noted the faint sheen of perspiration and the nervous flicker of his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "I hoped I wasn't intruding. I merely wished to see the progress of the investigation." "You've seen enough," she said softly, yet firmly. "More than you intended, I suspect." His smile tightened. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Your timing, Mr. Harcourt," she said, "and your sudden interest in the study suggest otherwise. Someone has been adjusting the ledger, altering evidence, and ensuring that attention fell on Mrs. Ellison." She gestured toward the corner where the faint imprint on the ledger remained visible. "You did not anticipate that I would notice a detail so small, nor that I would follow it to you." Harcourt's composure faltered. A muscle twitched in his jaw, and he stepped back slightly. I only sought to protect the family reputation. I did not intend—" "You manipulated events from behind the scenes," Miss Marple interrupted, calm as ever. "You let Mrs. Ellison act as your shield while ensuring that the letters, the ledger, and the evidence appeared to point elsewhere. The poison, the lavender, the disappearance, they were part of her design, yes, but your hand guided her actions, shaping the story to suit your own ends." The colour drained from his face. It was necessary," he stammered. "The estate, the family, no one must know the full story. I had to contain it." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, a comforting rhythm against the tension. "Necessary is how criminals often justify themselves," she said. "But necessity does not excuse interference in justice. You hoped to bury the truth and ensure your own security, but you overlooked the constancy of detail and observation. The truth finds a way." Harcourt sank into a chair, defeated. The constable moved closer, ready to take formal measures, while Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. The final twist had revealed the real mastermind, not the obsessive housekeeper, not the distressed relatives, but the quiet, calculating relative who had orchestrated shadows behind the scenes. Willowbrook Manor exhaled again, heavier this time, as if acknowledging the revelation. Miss Marple's sharp eyes swept the room one last time, noting every expression, every hesitation. The case was finally utterly resolved, not merely a matter of motives and actions, but of concealed intentions brought into the light. The following morning at Willowbrook Manor felt oddly still. Sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows, illuminating the quiet corridors and the gardens beyond, yet beneath the calm, the tension from the previous days still lingered. The constable had taken Mrs. Ellison and Mr. Harcourt into custody, ensuring that both would face the consequences of their actions, but Miss Marple knew that the ripple of these crimes extended far beyond simple confinement. The delicate threads of past and present had been pulled taut, and the consequences would echo long after anyone left the house. Miss Marple walked slowly through the study, pausing at the desk where so many pivotal events had unfolded. The red ink blot, the lavender-scented scrap of paper, the ledger with its subtle indentations. Each item seemed ordinary to an untrained eye, yet together the eye had revealed the truth. She carefully lifted the faint imprint still lingering on the ledger's page. "It is remarkable," she murmured, "how such a small detail, nearly invisible, can betray an entire scheme." The constable approached, notebook in hand. "I must admit, Miss Marple," he said, "even after all this, I struggle to see how you knew Mrs. Ellison and then Mr. Harcourt were involved. It seems impossible." Miss Marple smiled, gentle but unyielding. "It is often the smallest things that matter. The bell rung only once, the careful placement of the ledger, the repeated use of lavender, not as ornament, but as a signal. These were all habits observed over years, patterns left behind by someone who believed themselves meticulous enough to leave no trace. But traces exist for those willing to see them." She explained then how each clue had pointed to the culprits. Mrs. Ellison's obsessive attention to routine had marked her hand in the smallest details. The tea prepared precisely, the letters handled with unusual care, the order of rooms arranged after each intrusion. Her actions were those of someone controlling the environment, not a desperate criminal acting impulsively. The poison administered to Major Fletcher, the disappearance of Mrs. Pembroke, even the destruction of the letters, all calculated, all consistent with her obsessive sense of moral justice. Yet it was Mr. Harcourt who revealed the full depth of the deception. His subtle manipulation of evidence, the ledger alterations, The encouragement of suspicion toward Mrs. Ellison, the timing of events, showed premeditation on a broader scale. Unlike Mrs. Ellison, his aim was self-preservation cloaked as family loyalty. By orchestrating shadows, he attempted to conceal the truth, creating a smokescreen that nearly succeeded. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the faint ink indentation again. If you had not noticed a subtle impression left by the pen, the scheme might have remained unbroken for far longer. A careless touch, a whisper of habit, a single overlooked detail. These were the keys to unravelling a narrative that appeared seamless to the casual observer. The constable nodded slowly. "So justice has been served?" Miss Marple paused, glancing toward the open windows and the gardens beyond, where sunlight glinted off the yew tree and the rose beds remained untrimmed. "It has," she said softly, "but justice, like truth, is never tidy. Both Mrs. Ellison and Mr. Harcourt must answer for their deeds, yet the manor, and the people within it, will carry the memory of what occurred here for years. Justice may be delivered in law, but it does not erase the moral complexity, nor the scars left by obsession and deceit." She folded the ledger carefully and returned it to the cabinet. The letters were gone, yet the story they told endured. Every subtle gesture, every overlooked clue, every small act of human error or habit had contributed to the resolution. As she moved toward the drawing-room, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. "Some people believe that the resolution of a crime is a simple matter of right and wrong," she said aloud, to the empty room, "but the truth is rarely so straightforward. It is the interplay of observation, patience, and understanding human nature that reveals the answers hidden beneath appearances." The manor had regained a semblance of normalcy, yet the air remained tinged with an uneasy awareness. Justice had been served, but the memory of manipulation, the precision of planning, and the depth of obsession left a lingering sense that human motives were never as simple as they seemed. Miss Marple glanced one final time toward the gardens bathed in morning light. The house was silent now, the case closed in law, but the patterns, the subtleties, and the lessons of human behaviour remained, an enduring testament to the careful eye, the relentless mind, and the truth that, in the end, could not be buried. Willowbrook Manor was at peace, but she knew that in human affairs, peace was always a fragile thing, maintained not by the absence of wrongdoing, but by the courage to recognize it when it appeared. The sun had dipped low behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across Willowbrook Manor as Miss Marple made her way toward the gate. The constable followed at a respectful distance, carrying the final reports and the evidence now safely secured. The household had settled into a wary calm. Clara and Mrs. Pembroke had retreated to their rooms, speaking in low voices, while the remaining servants moved quietly about their duties, careful not to disturb the fragile equilibrium that had been restored. Miss Marple paused for a moment near the yew tree, its branches heavy with evening dew. The garden had endured untouched by the chaos of recent days, yet she could not help but note the faint trace of lavender still lingering in the air. A small, fragrant reminder of Mrs. Ellison's meticulous orchestration, even as justice had been delivered. A whisper of unease clung to the manor, subtle but insistent. She thought of the red ink, the faint impressions in the ledger, and the careful timing of every action. Each thread of the puzzle had fallen into place, yet one small detail still nagged at her. The scrap of paper she had discovered, the real truth cannot be left exposed, remained partially unexplained. Mrs. Ellison had admitted to her role, Mr. Harcourt had confessed to his manipulations, and yet the phrasing of that note implied the existence of a hidden observer, someone who had wanted control of the narrative preserved even beyond those two. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the empty driveway and the fading light of the horizon. It was a trivial detail, easily dismissed, yet she had learned to trust the instincts that arose from these minor anomalies. They were often the first whispers of a story yet to unfold, a subtle invitation to uncover the next layer of human behaviour. As she walked toward her car, she glanced once more at the manor. The windows reflected the last glimmers of sunlight, warm and untroubled, yet Miss Marple knew better. Houses, like people, never truly reveal all their secrets at once. She could almost imagine the walls murmuring, sharing hints of hidden histories, unspoken grievances, and choices made in quiet desperation. Even the smallest habits, An ink smudge, a misplaced key, the faint scent of lavender could carry meaning for those willing to notice. That lingering impression, the subtle clue that no one else might see, was often the seed from which a far greater story would grow. And Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and patient mind, would always be ready to follow it. The constable caught up with her at the gate, breaking the silence. "Are you satisfied, Miss Marple? Truly?" he asked, glancing back at the manor, as though expecting another revelation to leap from the walls. "I am satisfied for today," she replied, voice light but measured. "Though a story this complex rarely ends with perfect closure. There is always something just beyond the edge of our vision. A gesture, a word, or a forgotten object may hold the beginning of the next question, the next mystery. One must remain vigilant, or the truth slips quietly away." They fell into step together, leaving the gate behind. The gravel crunched softly underfoot, mingling with the faint evening breeze. Miss Marple's mind traced back over the events of the past days, the unassuming gestures, the patterns of behavior, the concealed motives that had driven extraordinary acts. Each revelation had been built on observation, patience, and the understanding of human nature's subtle complexities. Yet, as the manor receded into the distance, her gaze lingered on one particular window. The study, still bathed in the soft amber of sunset. Somewhere inside, she thought, a final trace of meaning remained, a whisper of history that had yet to be fully unearthed. Perhaps it was nothing, perhaps it was everything, but her instinct told her it was worth remembering, and with that she stepped into her car, the engine purring quietly. Willowbrook Manor lay behind her, resolved yet quietly restless, its secrets now partially revealed but never entirely surrendered. As the constable drove on, Miss Marple's mind drifted to the horizon, to the next hint, the next anomaly, the next whisper of truth waiting to be discovered. For one lesson was certain: mysteries never truly end. They only pause until someone, somewhere, notices the smallest detail that unlocks the story once more. The evening air carried a faint, elusive scent of lavender. Miss Marple inhaled it, a small smile forming at the corner of her lips. Somewhere another story awaited,